for some science! I was asked to present the evidence for the biblical creation model, or as I like to call it, what really happened. Today I'm going to do just that, keeping in mind that each of these topics could be its own week of discussion or an hour-long lecture by a PhD. I shall start by contrasting the two models. We remember the Darwinian Tree of Life. Every living thing, according to it, can be traced back through common ancestors until the first common universal ancestor is reached, which is something like a bacteria. The creation model, on the other hand, is not a single tree, but rather an orchard. The evidence is rather simple. One of the problems with the Darwinian Tree of Life is the absence of transitional forms. There is the limb representing the turtle kind, which branches off into the many varieties of turtle, and the limb representing the dog kind branching off into the many varieties of dog. But there is no evidence for there ever having been a half-dog, half-turtle. Nothing connects those two limbs except wishful thinking and blind faith in evolution. This lack of transitional forms is on the list of Achilles' heels for Darwinian evolution, but is actually evidence for the creation model. For the model built on the creation account in Genesis shows that the turtle limb is not a limb, but a separate tree. Similarly, the dog limb is its own tree. Each kind of animal is its own tree, thus the orchard. So, how do you define a kind? Molecular geneticist Dr. Georgia Purdom says that a kind represents the reproductive boundary of an organism. That is, the offspring of an organism is always the same kind as its parents, even though it may display considerable variation. Consider the orchard. Each tree has a trunk, and all of the branches share core similarities with the trunk. All turtles have common core turtle features. All bats have common bat traits. The trunk would be the created kind, and the branches would be the varieties which have diversified from that original gene pool. The variations that arise are weeded out through natural selection to produce those that are best fit to their environment, or, as I like to call them, the survival of the good enough for now. Did I just hear you wrong? Or did you define your creation model as working along evolutionary lines? Well, apparently you did hear me wrong because I said nothing about evolution. You did just call upon descent with modification, natural selection, and survival of the fittest. Those are all Darwinian ideas. Ah, but this is why we had to define evolution, because none of those ideas are evolution, even if they are used by evolutionists. Descent with modification happens, as we know it did in the dogs, because of the shuffling of existing genes and the occasional loss of genes from a population. The next generation of dogs is a little different than the last, but not because genes have been added. Thus, new varieties are created, the dog tree grows some new branches, but no evolution has occurred because these changes cannot grow the Darwinian Tree of Life. These changes will never turn a fish into a lizard. They can grow a tree in the creation orchard, but they can never grow the Darwinian Tree of Life. The deck has all of the cards in it, 52 cards. I shuffle and I deal and I get a hand of cards which was already in the deck. I can do this a million times or two and never get the same collection of cards from dealing. I can also change the outcome by leaving a card in the deck or hiding one up my sleeve. But while each successive hand is unique and different than the last, that's because the deck was full to start with and because I shuffle every time I deal. So the full deck is the original created kind, and from that parent kind come all of the variations that exist. Descent with modification, but due to shuffling or gene loss, not due to the arisal of new genes or new genetic information, which I will remind us we have never seen in nature. Darwin stole the idea of natural selection from Edward Blythe, a creation-minded scientist who had published on it several decades before Darwin's book would be published. He described it just as it is, and as Darwin would eventually understand it, as an editor. Nature shuffles the deck, but occasionally deals a bad hand, such as a cow with 5 legs. Because this hinders the cow's chance of survival or of reproduction, then the variation is selected out. The cow dies. The variation is selected out and is not passed on to future generations, and so the species remains more like the created kind than different. Darwin eventually realized that Blythe was right, that natural selection is an editor. It destroys harmful variations and it preserves beneficial ones. But Darwin also stated very clearly in writing that natural selection does not create any new variations. It can only act on variations that already exist. Common ancestry is just that. Members of a species come from some common ancestor. You and I have the same great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents if we go far back enough into our family history. Darwin would tell you that your great-great-great-great-grandmother was a rock. Literally a rock. But the biblical model says that kinds always come from the same kind, which is what we always observe in nature. Dogs all come from dogs. Turtles always come from turtles. Everything reproduces according to its kind, just as Genesis says, and we've never seen anything to the contrary. A litter of bunnies might look different than the parent bunnies, but they're still gonna be bunnies. They're never gonna be some kind of fish or tomato. There is an important historical event that affects the creation model. It is the flood of Noah. It happened a little more than 1,000 years after the creation. It's what we refer to as a genetic bottleneck. All of those trees in the creation orchard got pruned down to a single pair in that created kind. So the more than 400 variations of dogs that we have today are the great-great-great-grandpuppies of perhaps a single pair of dogs that were on the ark. None of those variations that exist today existed before the flood. You're not going to find poodles or chihuahuas in the fossil record. So, let me paint the picture thus far. God creates the orchard in the first week over a couple of days. The orchard, the full genetic deck, fans out into probably a wide variety of interesting critters, many of which are still preserved in fossils. But then the flood comes along, and so the trees each get pruned down to one pair per tree, taking a year-long non-pleasure cruise. Then, from those which got on the ark, the varieties of kinds which we have today descended from those seafaring great-grandparents. Now the key point here is that the Genesis account calls for plants and animals to reproduce according to their kind, and that is exactly what we observe. Evolution, on the other hand, demands that kinds give rise to different kinds. On Darwin, dogs, at some point in their past, came from non-dogs, and turtles came from non-turtles. But we never observe this, and have no evidence for it ever having happened, ever. Nothing spanning two kinds has ever been found alive now or in the fossil record. So, in a nutshell, that is the creation orchard and a basic summary of the creation model. Thanks for watching. This chapter and now all of the chapters in our Defining Evolution series are up on our new website, abitoforange.com, so go check that out. Thanks for liking and subscribing, and happy nachos.